Man, all-knowing and all-powerful, starting with the elderly wolf uncle. Chapter 30. No one directed. Chen Tian's expression was indifferent, and his breathing was not messed up for more than half a minute. I came here today to give you two choices, or surrender. Saying this, he paused for a moment, tilted his head to look at Jinhee, and the corner of his mouth hooked a grim smile. Or die. Who do you think you're talking to? On the other side, Jinhee suddenly raised his eyebrows when he heard this, and his head and face were extremely angry. Find death. The subordinates around him were equally angry and suddenly raised the guns in their hands. These people have been working for Jin for so many years, and they have never seen a guy who dares to be so arrogant here. The bullseye, who had been hidden in the shadows for a long time, had a cold look in his eyes, took out the steel ball and rolled it between his 5 fingers. Watching this scene, ready to go and waiting for the master's order. But I'm curious, why do you dare to make me submit? At this time, Jinhee, who was roaring with anger, suddenly changed his tone, suppressed his throat, and looked at Chen Tian's bloodthirsty sneer. It's not enough just because you can break into the building. Quote. Feeling Jinhee's transformation, the surrounding subordinates suddenly became nervous, and the suppressed anger erupted, even more terrifying than the anger released outside. You don't have a choice, Chen Tian said indifferently. Jin on the other side still wanted to say something, but suddenly his eyes inexplicably began to sour, and he rubbed his eyes to find that the surrounding environment had changed drastically. He came to a hospital. Yellowing ceilings, icy white lights, pungent smell of disinfectant water. Jin also recognized this hospital, which was the hospital that treated his wife and children. A few years ago, his wife and children were killed by his nemesis, and since then Kim has been alone and has no family. It was also from then that Kim began to rise by any means necessary, eventually becoming the only emperor of the underground world of New York City today. Only to return to this place that makes him sad again. Jin inexplicably felt that his heart, which had ignored everything, suddenly wavered. He stumbled along the memory to a door and saw his wife and children lying on the hospital bed inside. Vanessa, Richard, quote. Jin also shouted the names of his wife and children, collapsed and knelt on the side of the bed, his head bowed, his eyes red, and his huge grief swallowed him up like a big wave. HMPH, Jinhee, you are too embarrassed to even protect your family. In the future, you still obediently clamp your tail and stop being my opponent. You don't deserve it. When he looked up again, he saw that the man lying on the hospital bed had become his enemy, Sylvieman, who was laughing viciously and mocking himself. Next second, the real world. Damn it. Kim didn't actually go anywhere, just stood there and closed his eyes, and a few seconds later suddenly opened his eyes and came back to his senses in fear. The bullseye in the shadows saw that the master's expression had changed, mistakenly thinking that the latter was hurt, and immediately held the steel ball and prepared to strike. Don't move. But listening to Jin, he suddenly stopped him. Then Jin, he put his gaze on Chen Tian again, his eyes were strange, and he began to realize the strength of the latter. What can you bring me? Jinhee's eyelids moved, and the picture just now floated in front of him and asked. Your family. Chen Tian spoke indifferently. P.S. I also found that the protagonist's pressing is too low, and now I will raise his pressing frame. By the way, I will soon go to find Da Chao. Chapter 38. Jin's submission. Wanda is also here to listen to bedtime stories. My family? Jinhee was touched by Chen Tian's words and fell into silence, and the picture he had just seen in the spiritual illusion realm was vivid in his mind. After Chen Tian had psychic ability, even if he did not deliberately use his psychic ability, he could detect the other party's emotional changes. He knew that the underground emperor in front of him must be deeply trapped in the grief of the death of his family at this time, after all. The emotions that had been squeezed in his heart for many years. Being awakened again, in other words, anyone will be affected. Even if it is the underground emperor Jinhee. What's more, Kim doesn't care about his family. Thinking. Chen Tian once again quietly drove the spiritual fluctuations, constantly provoking every nerve of the other party, making the latter succumb subtly. This is a common method used by Professor Charles, and in the past, as long as people who knew the professor would be careful when meeting each other, they were invaded by the mind of this sophisticated guy. Such tools are most useful when people are most vulnerable. This is also the reason why Chen Tian previously let Jinhee fall into the illusion of the tragic death of his wife and children. And he must first tear some cracks in the other party's thinking to do better later. In fact, he did not expect to be able to make Jinhee obediently submit by violence at the beginning. After all, if people bow down as an underground emperor, it is difficult to ensure that they will not have a second heart in the future. It is still necessary to fundamentally change the other party's thinking so that they are willing to serve themselves from the bottom of their hearts. I think your proposal is fine, but I am not surrendering, but cooperating with you. Jinhee took a deep breath and looked at Chen Tian with a twinkle in his eyes, not realizing that his hostility towards the latter had been completely eliminated. At the same time, there is a strong trust in the heart. He recalled the ability that Chen Tian had shown all the way, and felt that as long as he tried his best to cooperate with the other party, he would definitely be able to exchange for his family. However, he did not know that in fact, it was the so-called cooperation. The moment he said it, he was completely surrendered to the teenager in front of him. As you wish. Happy cooperation. Chen Tian smiled when he heard this. He had just taken advantage of the gap between Jinhee's thoughts and wavering in his mind, and used his psychic ability to split the latter's personality in two. And locked up with a spiritual cage the personality that is hostile and suspicious of himself. After that, unless Chen Tian takes the initiative to untie the cage of his heart, Jin will have unreserved trust in him. The bullseye hidden in the shadows next to him always felt that something was wrong, but seeing that his boss agreed to Chen Tian's request, he stopped talking. After all, he serves Jin and gives the reward, not Jin he, as long as it does not affect him to take the money. After entering into a partnership, Jin he took Chen Tian to the office on the top floor. Say, what do you need me to do for you? Kim asked as he sat in his seat. At present, I need you to pay more attention to the people of Shield for me, and notify me as soon as there is any abnormal behavior. And sending someone to pick up some people at the Canadian border. Chen Tian said slowly, handing Jin he an address and a list at the same time. The people in his mouth are none other than Laura's experimental friends, who also escaped from the Akali Transgenic Institute, that is, the New Mutants. These young New Mutants also have a lot of roles, and can also form part of Chen Tian's future mutant country. So Chen Tian thought about taking them all in. 2 simple things. But I'm looking forward to challenging things more. Kim looked at the address and lists all hands and said there was no problem. As he spoke, he didn't even realize that he was standing in Chen Tian's perspective and thinking about the latter. There will be later. Chen Tian smiled when he heard this, and after explaining what Jin had done, he didn't stay too much and returned to the hotel. It was already late at night when Chen Tian returned to the hotel, and it had been more than an hour since he went out, but it was only more than an hour. He actually let the underground Emperor Jin he submit, and let this guy who controls most of the underworld in the northern part of the United States be willing to do anything for him. If this matter gets out, it will definitely make the entire underworld of the United States tremble. Knock knock. As soon as Chen Tian returned to the room to take a bath, not long after lying down, someone knocked on the glass window. Laura, how are you standing here? He looked up and saw Laura's petite figure standing outside. Is there something to find me? Why don't you come in through the main entrance? Chen Tian hurriedly got up and opened the window, watching the other party quickly turn over from the windowsill into the room, and asked with doubts. For the little girl's late-night visit, he didn't have any unusual associations. After all, the other party was only 14 years old, how could he have other thoughts? Laura remained silent and did not answer, but pointed to her nose to indicate that she smelled blood. A pair of big eyes stared at Chen Tian full of question marks. I just went out to do something. First chapter previous chapter 30.